I've got the privilege of introducing Professor Jenni Case to you. She's from the Chemical Engineering faculty at UCT. And for many of you Churchill scholars, you will know Jenni. She's been coming to Doc Weeks, certainly since I've been at Rhodes and probably before that. And she's part of, is it the Social Inclusion Project, you're a supervisor. So I don't think she needs introductions, but for some of us in education, we only got to know Jenni as an author through the book with the reading group in education that we took this as a book that we were going to read. And then some people said, well, can't we speak to Jenni? Can't we hear from her voice? And so Sue and I were chatting, and we found a way to get Jenni here to serve two purposes for us. So what I've done is our reading group has posed some questions which I've given to Jenni to say, I don't know if you can answer these really big questions in such a short space of time, but also to just take us through some of the processes of her book. And why we loved her book so much is some of us were really starting with critical and social realism and could not navigate the territory very well. And this provided a fairly easy, applicable way into understanding some of the really tough theories. And so Jenni, first of all, well done. It's really helped a lot of us in our faculty to get into it. But yeah, just to say thank you. And let's start off with your questions. Well.
Thank you Kelly, thanks for that. And that does feel daunting. When I saw the program, I assumed there'd be like one table of people to talk to, and I had this major thing, do I even want to create PowerPoints? So I really didn't expect to have a group like this, but I had Plan B in hand, which is a way of trying to connect with who's here, and we're going to go to that quite soon. But just to say, I love coming to Grahamstown. It's actually been a very significant connection in my academic life over about the last 5 years. Just something about the people here and the way they work, and it's been a big encouragement to me. So I always come here and I feel a space for thinking and discussing. So thanks for inviting me. You can see from this first slide, I just really didn't feel like giving you a lecture, so I didn't even feel like giving it a title of the standard title, first part, second part. So there's a cheeky, that's the title of my talk. And these are the things that are in my head: student learning, research in student learning, research in the social world, using theory, using methodology, trying to make some sense, trying to build knowledge. So that's the sort of, that explains where I'm wanting to go. Do people at the back, you don't want to come to the front? Or are you happy? I mean, I do know that kind of like got at the back with your laptop, so you got options. But at any rate, does it work for me? I'm just conscious of the room and the voice and so on. So the weird thing, Nompilo's helping me because we're on a computer that's not mine, so we can record this for better or worse. I mean, we can always ditch the recording at the end if we don't like it. But so the mic I've got is going into there. But if this works for me to sort of be somewhere around here, you can hear me all right. Put your hand up if you can't. So not to really say too much, but it's kind of, I've been nearly 20 years in a chemical engineering department, being a higher education researcher. It's been a very interesting journey. It's hard to even start to explain that sometimes even to myself. And indeed, the talk in a way does, the starting point was to talk to the book, which I published last year, and for myself still trying to work out the meaning of some of that. So to try and connect with all of you, this is the plan. What am I wanting to know? Because otherwise I'm going to give a talk that's of no relevance to anyone here. Point one, what are you researching or hoping to research? Now, when I said in grandmother language, I don't want using like specialization codes to, I don't know. I want to hear if you had to explain to your grandmother the significance of your research. What is the problem that you are hoping to address? in very straightforward, accessible language. The second one, what do you want from the seminar? And maybe you just, it's on the program and I'm here, you can say that as well. But maybe you might have questions, and I'm sure we're quite a mixture. There's some people here I think have looked at my book, but there are many others I guess who haven't. So what do you want to get from it? What did you think the title was about? Any further queries? 2 questions. What are you researching and what do you want from the seminar? Who's going to speak for this group? Because I know you entered something. Evelyn.
Yes, I'm researching.
Yeah.
Looking at research production in historical black institutions.
Yeah.
And the reason, what I want to get from here is clarity on use of social realism.
Okay. So research production in historically black universities and wanting to get some more clarity on social realism. Great. Here?
I'm researching on plagiarism in higher education, and I also want to get more insight into social realism.
Okay, great.
Higher education leadership practices in the context of social justice. I'm interested in how social realism can be used to explain stratification.
Okay. Stratification institutions. Okay. Explain stratification, right? Let's see here. Yeah.
Okay, I'm looking at academic staff development and use of digital technologies in higher education and using social realism. On this, more on social realism.
Okay. Sue, it's been said. Okay, anything new from the back rows? A few comments? One? Yes.
There are 2
Language? In developing countries. And what you wanted from this seminar?
Yeah, I wanted to explore research, how to higher social realism, and how to get information from
Okay, so doing research. What's here? Anything to add? It's been said. We'll go, okay, so we go more with the job students. Let's hear a few comments.
I'm looking at knowledge practices in educational leadership and management through universities and colleges at master's level. And what I'm hoping to get out of this seminar is basically to see how we use a variety of theories and bring them together as a building project.
Bringing theories together, bringing a range of theories together. Comments? Especially you can speak for people around yourself. Yeah.
I'm also interested, from the seminar, I'm interested in the use of theory. I'm looking at access into green economies for education and international in South Africa.
Oh, okay. Access to green economies for education and international students. Here's some comments here.
An influence and constraint for online teaching and learning.
Online teaching, yeah.
Yes, and working on critical research and how we like to
Okay, right. Here's some comments here.
I want to research my own practice in academic
Testing?
test intuitions that I have.
Okay. Okay. So a good place to start is intuitions. Comment to add?
Oh yeah, looking at adoption and use of energy efficient stoves and
Adoption of energy efficient?
stoves.
Oh, stoves, yes,
Yeah,
yes.
and I'm hoping to learn how different theories work.
Okay, how different theories work. Nice, yes.
Effect of a professional development course on teacher education practice.
Okay, right. And from here, anything specific?
Yeah, the use of methodology, as well as hopefully a better understanding of social realist approach or approaches.
Yes, yes. And around here.
I'll be looking at cumulative knowledge building in postgraduate student writing using LCT and systemic functional linguistics. And I'm interested in seeing how you apply theory to data and then take it back to theory.
Okay. Working from theory to data and back to theory again. And let's hear something from here.
I'm doing some work looking at knowledge and its circulation in waste management EPWP projects.
Okay.
I want to understand how I can use social realism in looking at my data.
Okay, so this is a very, very interesting group of people. There's a mixture of a whole of higher education questions, which I recognize around plagiarism and postgraduate writing, and educational leadership and stratification of institutions. And I know some of your other projects as well. And then there's, from the environmental side, eco-stoves, green economies. So I guess the starting point is that social realism may not be what you're looking for. And I guess, and I want to make that point sort of repeatedly, because there's lots of theories out there, and there's only one reason to use theory, is because it helps you do your research. But it is also a point when you're engaging in social science, you have to know about a broader range of things that are out there, even the things that you're not using, because that's part of your higher education, and the PhD is the most significant level of the higher education. So so I won't say to anyone, maybe you should leave now, because I think it's useful, every extra piece of theory, if we're talking about the broad field of social science research. And so many of us, well, I mean, some of you are lucky to have this, but I didn't have an undergrad in social science. So if you're like me, you're always playing catch up. You're always feeling that there's maybe something you missed and you've got to read more. And I was thinking, while I was a PhD student, a lot of people I was studying with were doing stuff in postmodernism, cultural studies, and so on. And there weren't many people doing science education. So I joined these cultural studies people for their reading groups, mainly just because I wanted sort of connections. And it really was totally different to what I was doing, but it really put me instead in terms of understanding a whole field, or not obviously a whole field, but knowing enough about it that if I saw an article that was using deconstruction or whatever, I kind of knew what they were trying to do. So I think that's the important piece. And I think we do make the mistake that we sometimes, I think in my own work, my work with students, we sort of find a theory, we say, this is your theory. And off you go and read everything that Arch has read, but then you haven't read stuff by Bourdieu or whatever, and you can't really locate it. So what I have got here, which is great, are some questions from the reading group. So, I mean, that's the other kind of weird thing. So I'm sort of nervous to ask this, but who's read this book? Because just to know who my audience is. Because, actually about half of people sitting here read this, half maybe haven't. So that's also quite an interesting mix. And so I've got questions here that are also useful. Please explain in layman's term the concept of emergence. So a great question, and I have got that in my formal talk that I'm going to. And let me just say right now, I'm still struggling with it myself. In your engineering study, it says, what were the selection criteria for acceptance into the 4-year and the 5-year study programs? So that's the case study that's in the book. Some of the students had come through an extended program, a 5-year program, some through a 4-year program. At that time, in which these were students who had admitted about 2001, the students admitted to the 5-year program had just got below the admission criteria to the 4-year program. It was different 5 years before them, and it's slightly different now as well. But that was the system, so that one we can answer. Whoever asked that, I'm quite happy to chat more with you. How do you shift, these are really nice questions, from the interpretive paradigm to using social realism? And, Kelly was saying to me, and correctly, I draw in the study on stuff I did in my PhD, which long before I'd heard about social realism, I was using really a constructivist interpretive lens. And you will see I do make a comment to that in the chapter on critical realism. It was a great relief to me read something, I don't know if it was Danemark and them, someone saying, of course, you can have collected data in for a different purpose and you can reinterpret it. I mean, of course you can, you know. You may not have collected what you need, so that is possible. And actually, if you can design something up front, knowing what you're looking for, it can help. Shift into social realism, I guess the comment, and it will come to here now, I think working, and I don't want to knock constructivism maybe as much as some of my humanities colleagues did. And if I can give you one resource, if there's another piece where I've talked through the book, I did an inaugural lecture in 2012, and it's actually on YouTube, if you can bear to watch me talking again. It's just, if you're looking for the link shot, otherwise Jenni Case Student Learning, I think, will take you there. The internet's quite interesting, because if you just Google Jenni Case, there's a former porn star in the US called Jenni Case. So we've had so many jokes about, like, my previous career, and so I'm, okay, it's not actually me. But I talk quite explicitly in the inaugural about shifting from that the value of moving to constructivist thing from the classic scientific training to say that the way people perceive the world matters and there are different perceptions. The challenge going to social realism is actually only in the space of building explanation. And I think that explanation is hard to build. And Kelly was asking. We can work, the actual grade, you know, that's like pass and fail rates and all that. We're quite good at the empirical world of subjective experience. I mean, those of you who've done discourse or whatever, we're pretty good at that. This thing of moving now to talk about structure, agency, and culture and their workings, and I will talk to that in this talk today. How did you transform your thesis into a book? So the answer, there's a bigger question for how did you write a book, I suppose, because this doesn't come straight from my PhD thesis. I did my PhD in 2001, and this was written 10 years after that. So the sort of heart of the study was that I had in fact, no, what I've just realized, no, my PhD is not here. That's interesting. Yeah, this is a study I did after my PhD. So, okay, my PhD was in the late 90s, and I got in 2001, and that was a study of second-year Chem Eng students. And in 2002, I thought it was time for fresh data, and I went and did a very crazy, it was almost a year together with these third-year students, doing the course with them and interviewing them as I went along in 2002. And then confessions, I spent about a decade actually working through that data. It was very rich. I mean, I also had babies and stuff, so every now and then I picked up and did a little bit more. And in 2011, I thought, what about I actually try and track down the students who were third years in 2002, find out what they're doing, and started a process of telephone interviews. And so those are the follow-up interviews here. So the actual data from my PhD is not here, but I suppose where I'm getting confused is that the methodologies really are the classic student learning research, which I started with. So I guess we should head on now with a little bit of structure, but what I'm hearing from you is quite a lot like, just talk us through some of the fundamentals, and I'll try my best on that, and then talk practically about how do you do research. So let's run with this, and I mean, I hope I didn't waste too much time with all the glitches, but maybe what I should do is, because we've got till 4.
Yeah, the next thing's at 5.
Yeah, but we don't abuse people's time. Kelly, let me try and sort of run through this talk in like 30, 35 minutes. And then let's open up for questions, if you're happy with that. So, and sorry that it cuts off on the top there, but, so this is really my response to the question of what are you researching? So my interest is in student learning, and it's something that has interested me for about 15 years. I've been working in that area. Thank you. Great. And I start the book, and those of you know, with a narrative of one of the students in the study. And these are my issues, okay. So, by the way, I've taken little clips every now and then, and sometimes given pages. Oh, by the way, you can obviously have these slides if you want. I mean, we can make them available. So these are the questions around access and success. That's really the heart of the matter. Who gets into higher education, who succeeds? And I think we're going to be researching that for a long time, because these are not trivial matters. And there are my questions. How can we widen participation beyond the traditional elite for higher education? How can we increase the proportion of entrants who are able to successfully graduate? But then there's another set of questions. Those are quite technical questions, sort of efficiency questions, that I started asking at the start of this book. What is the purposes of higher education? And I mean, in my case here, what is the purpose of the engineering degree? May seem very obvious. Train engineers who go and do engineering type things in economy. But so is that it? Or what this extraordinary investment that society makes in higher education? And social realism enabled me to ask those questions in a way that I hadn't been able to ask when I was coming in more sort of psychological type framings of student learning. So I want to start talking about common sense and the problem with common sense. And I think in every one of your areas there's a common sense. So plagiarism, I know the common sense is students are bad and they cheat, okay? What's the common sense? Postgraduate students, well, they can't write. It's the common sense. They don't want to write. They're lazy. There's another common sense there. Stratified institutions. There's a common sense there about which institutions are for who and so on. So in student learning, this is the common sense. So we look at a class of students and we say some are succeeding, some are not succeeding. What makes the difference? And then you get studies around student motivation. Because then you can design a little questionnaire and you ask students, how many hours a day do you study? Some version of how committed are you to your studies? What are your reasons for being here? And then you can find, voila, a correlation that you get highly motivated students are doing well. Now, I'm sort of sounding jokey-like, but people are still doing these studies. Now, that is, and really, by the way, if I want to flag someone who I really think you should read on methodology, it's Andrew Sayer. Method in Social Science, 91, with the second edition, deals with this issue more than anywhere else, and this really educated me around the problem with common sense, and obviously in realism we say it's called the epistemic fallacy. The idea that the world is the way we think it is. And ergo, then we just get empirical data to add into that. That is problematic because the world is much more complex than that. And to be limited by our own understandings of our own situation is to sit with stuff that doesn't really help us. Significantly also, to find a correlation between two things is not to get an explanation. And Sayer makes that really clear. So a correlation, because there's a pattern. We've got a questionnaire called student motivation, and then we've got like GPAs, and we find they correlate. So, we now have explanatory theory on why students succeed. Well, I would say no, we don't. We just got a range of things that come together with succeeding, but we haven't really got down to anything that really can help us shift the way things work. So the common sense way of looking, there's the success in my area, student learning. There's some good, successful students, unsuccessful students. Another thing that I found very problematic is to look for factors. There's another question for you here. Factors, so let's find the factors associated with student success. Be very careful of, for me, factors type explanation, because it presumes a certain way the world is. That there are these variables that link in a causal manner to some outcome. And essentially, if this one is up, then the outcome is up. It rests on a certain model of causality, and that's what I'm going to come to soon, and where social realism gives you a model of causality that I think is more appropriate for the social world. So common sense, I think, is limited. So then I thought, and I think this is really important for us as researchers in South Africa, in education, in higher education I speak to particularly, around theory. And this is the kind of, why do you need theory? And I like Carl Mayton's saying, you only need as much theory as you need, as this problem demands. And I would claim, I would recognize even in myself the scenario of getting sort of trapped in theory. Because it's such hard work, especially if you come out of whatever background some of us came out to, get your head around epistemology, ontology, all this stuff, that you kind of get into thinking that that's what the whole purpose of the PhD is to be able to work with theory and use these words intelligibly. So this is what I've come to think I need from theory for the problems that I'm interested in. Now, I'm interested in access and success in higher education. I'm also interested in the purpose of higher education. So number one speaks to my issue about, and Sue, thanks, you've also pointed out issues around motivation as an explanation for student success. And I think it's something that needs more exploration. And Andrew Say is really good on this. In my head, are you talking about real entities? And by real entities, I mean things that have properties and powers. So, and that potentially can have a causal relationship with each other. And I would argue, to go back to my example, that motivation is not actually a causal link to success. I actually think it's just a manifestation of success, to be honest. I think when students are in that successful place, they're going to look motivated and enthusiastic, they're going to have good emotional affect and all the rest, and they're going to work hard. But so if we want to build an explanatory, you know what I was thinking this morning when you were listening to Carl, it's a very nice, people go and nod in this audience. It gives you a sense of where you are. Thank you for that. So if we're going to build explanations, we need to know that the things we're talking about are real entities. Andrew Say on this, you can Google the term, talks about chaotic conceptions is the opposite of real entities. So just because two things correlate, they might be chaotic conceptions. And I think it's a term from Marx, actually. Those who know that better can help me. The second one is very much related, because I don't think that the kind of causality that's going to answer our questions is direct and linear. The sort of lever, you can see I work with engineers. Like my dean talks about finding the levers that we can pull that have these like outcomes. You know, it's like mechanical, you know, so if we can press the motivation knob, whoop, we get the outcomes, you know. It's not that. And number two is the issue of emergence. Okay, emergence is a different type of causal link. And I'm still grappling with that. There might be people who are further along the line than I'm here. Number three, and I can't think there's any South African social scientist who would not agree with me on number three. I need a model of how the past influences the present. How, you know, is it deterministic? So because you were born, you know, black in a township, your life is going to run a certain way. Well, you know that's not true. Is it that it doesn't influence it at all and you can do anything you like? Well, if you've read Archer at all, you'll know she holds those two polarities up and she says they both lack in. We need an engagement, and this is the engagement of structure and agency. Number three is about structure and agency, because the cycles of the past are imprinted on structure, for Archer structure and culture, and that conditions the present. It doesn't fully determine your agency. I've got a slide for each of these, which then talks to Archer's thing. Which is number four, you need a complex model of human agency. And maybe just being human more generally would be, how do we talk about our personal self, our desires, our interests, our social self, our social interactions? And I remember early on in student learning research, especially coming from science education, you either were like, I think it was called a personal constructivist, so you were just interested in individual learn and their brain and everything was sort of Piaget thing, or you were a social constructivist and everything was about learners making meaning amongst themselves. You were in the one camp or you were in the other camp. And you picked your camp and then you went forward. But I mean, if you hang around in thinking about learning, you can't be just one or the other. It's not, it is actually both of those coming together. How do they come together? Number four. Number five, I think, and I don't think we really are properly understanding this, that the context we're in, specifically in South Africa in 2014, is very fast changing. I don't think our research is keeping up with that. And I'm particularly talking about the context in which young people are coming into higher education and then making things of their worlds in their time through higher education, mediating constraints and going out into the world of employment and creative work. We all know the conditions for that are different to the conditions when the rest of us did our undergrad studies. But exactly how are they? I don't think we have research that speaks to that yet. The long and short of number five is you can't be relying on the findings from the past. Number six, which I left entirely to Carl Mayton yesterday and today, is you've got to have a theory of knowledge. But I'm not going to talk to that now because I can't talk to everything, okay? But clearly, and in a way, something that my colleague Delia Marshall has made quite clear. Those of us come from science and engineering, well, I'd like to say we never left knowledge behind. So the thing of vertical knowledge in science, and we've always worked with that. I don't know, I sometimes think some of that is about the humanities coming to connect with that space and finding a theory of knowledge that works there. And our Carl's works obviously contributed a lot in that regard. So okay, so then two sort of caveats. So this goes back to my first thing, is to say, I would really be horrified if you all went out of here and used Margaret Archer, because then I've done something very wrong, because I think her theory will be useful for certain questions, and I still have an open question about how well it works for education, and I attempted to demonstrate that in my book, but some questions are going to work for some not. So this apparently attributed, actually, sorry, that should be 1966. It's quite old. If all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Don't go around there hammering Archer, 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 and squashing things that aren't nails. Finding a little flower and going blam, Archer. I don't know, you can go along that metaphor. So that was the thing in my head yesterday. I was thinking about this talk. So take cognizance of everything. Be aware of the full landscape, but then be looking for what you need for your study. And then just a little bit around book. And I gave more of a talk last year, sort of quite personal talk of how this book came to be. So I'll just say briefly here. I had a sabbatical, a very exciting sabbatical in the US, and I thought I should do something useful with it, and I had this idea, I want to write a book. Okay, so that's where it started, but I didn't know what I was going to write about. And then I realized I didn't have a hell of a long time, so it was not going to be a very long book. And secondly, it had to be stuff that I was already in my head. And I was at that time grappling with a range of theories in the area of sociology of knowledge, social realism. I had a colleague who had used some Archer. And I had this idea, let me go and phone all those students I saw 10 years ago and find out what they're doing. So, which is really the third point. It kind of was a point in time. So also, I think we should read any book in that way. You know, we tend to think suddenly the book has got this like solidity. It was, very importantly, bullet 2, writing to figure things out for myself. It's by no means any final word on anything. It's a drawing together of stuff and working with my own data to try and illustrate what I think the theories mean. But much more needs to be written beyond that. At a point in time, it will not be much use on your bookshelf because there'll be more useful things out there. And of course, go and read, if you're going to use Archer, of course you have to read Archer herself. Don't go into?
Don't go into sales. Book sales especially. You're telling us all the reasons not to read your book.
Yeah, no, I would be terrible at that. Absolutely. Some people are better than that. I'm just saying, see it in context. And number 4, I've said so often here, so I don't need to say it again. But no, you know what I do? Look, it's you made my day over tea this morning, right? Saying, okay, here I'll say. You said I picked your book up and I read it from cover to cover over 2 days. No, I mean, like if you want to have your day made, so that made my day. And I'm pleased people have said they find it an accessible introduction, and I'm just delighted to give that to you. And I will totally confess, and maybe because I never had an undergrad introduction to sociology and so on, that I found secondary writers always a useful starting point. And then you go to the Bernstein or the Archer or whatever, and then it makes a lot more sense. But you need someone to help you scope it out. Right. So, yeah, what's there? Okay, so I mustn't do like, oh, ignore that chapter, ignore that chapter, ignore that chapter. Really what I'm going to speak to today is what's sitting there in chapter 4 and in chapter 6, which is really the Archer theory. Chapter 5 is a bit of Bernstein, Maton, and so on, and I certainly used aspects of it, but you might find other people more substantial in that. Number 3 is the critical realist basics, and obviously the starting point is my own narrative getting into things. Okay, so I had 5 things we needed, and the first thing was we need to know what we're talking about, and we need to know we have real entities and we can build real explanations. So if you're using Archer, this is what we're talking about: structure, culture, and agency. She puts them around the other way, SAC, SAC. So if you're not talking structure, culture, and agency, then you're not doing an Archer explanation. Of course, there's just one type of explanation. What I see is her, this slide I pulled from my inaugural because it's still useful for me. So the starting point is the structure agency issue. And you can't do sociology if you're not thinking about people and the social structures and how the interaction is. And my two pictures of UCT, they are meant to indicate accounts that are very structure related. There you can see Jamison Hall. Can't see the people much. And there's a photograph of one of my students, which is a more people focus. It's just using a wide angle and a zoom lens. But that's an image of my head of the structure type accounts and the agency type accounts. If anything coming out of like student learning, more psychological research, we worked a lot with agency, versions of agency, the learn and what they can do. What Archer adds to this is to say, okay, structure, actually we're going to disaggregate to structure and culture. Culture is the world of ideas. Any of you grew up on discourse analysis, you know how to work with the world of culture, the ideas that are out there. Structure is what sociologists always call structures, as roles, institutions, positions, things that relate to material goods. So long and short is, and so I'm just giving you a little snapshot of this, and I've written about this more in the book, but if we're going to move from the world of the actual to the empirical to the real, if we're going to talk about the real, we need to talk about the workings of structure, culture, and agency. How do they fit together? I'll get to in, I think, 3 slides. So the next thing is about emergence. And again, here I'm sure there might be more brilliant people in the room as well. But emergence is a model of causality that's not simple. It's not you press that button and then you get that outcome. What happens here is when you have two things coming together, what results is more than just the sum of the two. And here's something I've been working with around teaching and learning. I'm happy to it's something I'm grappling with, happy to share with us in another talk, or you can read something I've written. How do teaching and learning interact? Now, there's some work out there that has like teachers who teach in this way, then you get learners who learn in this way. Approaches to teaching, approaches to learning, and we can see they correlate. Yay, it's great. And I mean, look, I don't want to knock people who do good stats, but I just feel that work leaves me lacking because I don't think it really explains learning and the relationship between teaching and learning. Those accounts tend to actually diminish them. And I've been quite attracted to work by Paul Ashwin, which talks about a teaching-learning interaction. It actually speaks to a relationship. And in fact, Archer, when she talks about emergence, she uses a relationship as an example. And any of you who are in a marriage or long-term type relationship, you know that you've got your partner, and then your relationship actually has a separate causal reality to the two of you. It's not just the sum of the two of you. It's not defined fully by one or the other. It has its own something. I don't have the language to speak to that. And it's causal because it constrains and enables action. It's not just, it's by virtue of being married or living together, whatever, but it's relational goods is Archer's terms. And that really got me thinking about teaching and learning. I think there's a relationship there which explains the causality. How do we do that? It's complex. Notice I've got there strata, so like geological strata, and I haven't talked a lot about this, but this is the key thing on all realist explanations, so not just Archer, but the idea of a stratified world, a stratified ontology. And really what that means for me is things that are different strata don't relate directly, they relate by virtue of emergence. The other explanation that I think Sayer uses, I don't know about you, but I've always felt people who say, oh, here's the latest neurological finding, so surely this now explains why students fail at higher education. And you kind of got to know there's something missing. And of course, at one level, we are neurons. But then there's another level of my brain. And then there's another level of being in this class. And there's another phenomenon of the university. And those are not just simple, oh, there's different, there's layers of emergent causality between those things. So that briefly is to say where I'm seeing emergence coming in. Number 3, so I said we need to know what we're talking about. We need to have a model of causality. Number 3, we need to know how does the past influence the present. And this, I spoke to recently, and there's a little bit of my writing on page 39, which I thought, this is just to try and make the link to the book. It's not mechanistic and it's not deterministic. Structures cannot cause people to do things. The causal effects of structures are always mediated by human agency. Structures make certain choices more attractive and more feasible to the individual. In that sense, they are causal. They make certain courses of action more likely. But the causality is only activated in the context of the agent and their potential actions. So if you're not interested in doing something, a particular constraint will not have any bearing on your life. Here now comes to the heart of how do we build this into an explanation? How does the past influence the present? And this is Archer's take. And really, I understand there are people who live in the theory world and we want to, and Archer herself spends about half a book sort of always defending her version against someone else's. I don't know. I don't have enough of that background. I've got a student who's worked with Bourdieu, and I don't have an issue that Bourdieu, I think, is incredibly valuable for certain questions in higher education, incredibly so. But for the particular things I've been interested in, I think Archer actually gives us quite a lot. So this is one of, okay, I mustn't, Sue says I keep on talking my book down, but I think there's a space. Those of you who are very graphical, Archer's work needs better graphics. Big ad. Go and write your book and have better diagrams, because I wanted to, but I'm not really graphical either. So this is, it's a better vision, I think, than Archer's one, but it's still, because what have you got? You've got structure. So let's follow this. Structural conditioning. Then you've got interaction. So this is the world of the present. We're watching what's happening, and here's the outcome. We get structural elaboration. And if we follow the workings of structure, so that's roles, positions, institutions, we call the interaction happening on those terms social interaction. That's just an Archer term. And of course, the end of one cycle influences the start of another. But of course, structure then influences, well, obviously the next structure, but it also influences culture. Here's cultural conditioning. And by the way, this would be T1 for those of you who use the Archer terminology. I just find that is another layer of obscuring. This is T2 to T3, and there's T4. The interaction, when we're talking about what's happening in the world of people interacting around ideas, we're using the word social cultural interaction. These arrows are crucial, and this is why it's so difficult. Because in the world of things happening, structure and culture are completely intertwined. Archer says there's value in disentangling them, and that's central to the Archer analysis, actually to say people, for example, who had particular roles that carried certain power relations were able to, therefore, influence people to take on their ideas and so on. So, but you always have to disaggregate them. I do not want to say that is easy. So, but this is, if you want to do an Archer analysis, you've got to look at time, you've got a starting point, you've got an ending point. At the start, you've got to look at the conditioning, both structure and culture. How are the roles distributed? How are the goodies distributed? What do the institutions look like? How integrated is it? How disaggregated is it? Culture, what are the ideas at play? And I think that's the next thing I want to, so we can work with this a hell of a lot. So culture is quite complicated, and there's a whole book she writes on this, and terminology is messy. I don't want to say structure is easy, because really, roles and institutions and salaries and power, that sort of power, that's not straightforward. I think for us working in the kind of questions we're in, the situational logics in the world of culture are often going to be important. And I'm working on such a nice project with Sue McKenna at the moment, where we've been trying to make sense of this in the context of an academic development project in engineering. We're trying to look at what are the logics at play. In short, there's a whole lot here, but I just kind of put these things in because I wanted to show that did relate to the book, and there's some page numbers. But you want to see, have we got a situation where ideas are in logical contradiction to each other, or are they in logical agreement? And the nice thing about Archer, but you can get this from a lot of different social theories, if you want change to happen, you've got to have a clash of ideas. It should make you feel good about being South African. No, it's why this is such a dynamic place. Everything is very contested. But that is the space where change happens and society changes. If you have all the ideas in agreement with each other, you're less likely to get change. So that's the first thing we're looking at. And there, her word complementarities, that's obviously things that agree with each other, and contradictions. Then I prefer to just use the word necessary and contingent to keep things easy, because I don't like too many terms. And this is quite difficult. When relations are necessary, the one idea needs the other. They kind of actually, even though they might be disagreeing with each other, they can't ignore the other idea. The South African white university in the 1980s could not ignore the anti-apartheid movement, even though it would be fair to argue it wasn't completely in line with it. They couldn't ignore it. A contingent contradiction is one that you could ignore. It's independent, you could ignore it. And so you've got 4 different possibilities, and based on each of those possibilities, you get a different logic. As I said, if you've got complementarities, you're not going to get a lot of change, especially if they're necessary complementarities, you get protection. Ideas reinforce each other. If they're contingent, well, you can get exploration of new ideas, but there's not going to be a massive impetus for change. If you've got contradictions, elimination, if they're contingent, you've got to try and get rid of it, but usually you get modified by doing that. Correction is a very interesting logic, and we're looking at the logic of necessary contradiction. We are building an argument about how that has explained academic development in higher education. So in the book, I do also try and explain these in the context of engineering education, which was my case study. And there it's very interesting. You've got industry with its set of ideas, you've got the university with its set of ideas, and how do they work out. If you want to do cultural conditioning, sorry guys, you've got to do this stuff, because this is Archer's work, and it's not easy. I have to tell you, just this whole talk, if you came to think I was going to tell you all the answers, I am working with the stuff myself. A model of human agency, just sort of moving, I'm just really sparking off a few things. Yes.
The logics, do they apply more to a macro level than looking at specific people coming into a context? So if you're looking at education, programs.
Well, you've got to choose your level. So Kasturi's answer is, what level are these things? Macro, micro? I think the thing is, you're talking about ideas. What ideas are at play in a space? And then you've really got to decide, is my interest the department? Is my interest the institution? It's quite complicated. In actual fact, I've got a PhD students who are working on that. And really, sometimes you have to trace things down from the institution. Then there's a layer of a refraction to some degree to the department, and then maybe even into a program. I just wanted to say briefly, and this I said earlier on, how does the stuff of the individual and stuff of the social, how does this build together? Firstly, Archer's got for the person this model of personal identity that I really do like. And really central to this, I mean, there's the emergence of self as a baby. This is the person making sense for themselves of what matters for themselves. And you can see, if I'm interested in student learning, this really is a very valuable framework. And I've always had this interest long before I had an Archer framing of this. I've looked at the reasons students chose in engineering and their own making sense of why they're there. This relates to what Archer calls personal identity. The other thing is, how does personal identity relate to social identity? Here's really social identity. You cannot get away from social identity. You're born into a social identity. It's what Archer calls primary agency. And these are your group locations. You are like, white, middle-class, English-speaking South African of the suburbs, or whatever. Then you get the possibility of corporate agency, and that's becoming part of a student movement, maybe, that has a certain social objective. The really interesting thing, and I am raising the question about whether we expect to see this in higher education, is the formation of the social actor. You're a social actor when you can pull personal identity and social identity together. So both what matters to you and the role that you have socially are in congruence with each other. I think many academics are social actors. I can think of a lot of people. And that's, of course, are key instruments for social change. moving on, and it's not got too much more. This one, you don't really need Archer to answer this question, but I said this is really important. I think the social context we live in is very dynamic, fast changing. I think I'm going to hopefully be about another 5 minutes. Yeah. Long and short, I think we've got such interesting research to do, and that's why I say don't get stuck in theory. Go and get the empirical data and start telling us the stories of what are happening there. But of course, if you can't build to some kind of explanatory theory, then you're just describing. Well, describing is nice. It's a bit what Mayton had it is like low semantic gravity. There's a space for a lot of that work, but it will be really interesting if we can understand now why are things as they are. And that's the realist question. How did the world come to be as it is? As I say, I think that the space of agency for young people in this country, let me qualify that. For those that are making it to higher education, I think there are a lot of people who are not getting to a space of being able to enact much of themselves, possibly the majority of our young people, what's the term, the NEETs, not in employment, education, or training. So I do grant, those of us who are looking at higher education are looking quite a special group. But I think interesting things are happening. Of course, who had the project about marginalized people getting into the green economy? You've got a very interesting project there. Because I think that's, again, if the external environment is shifting, then there are new niches people can move into. Yeah, I've hammered on this a little bit. I'm sorry to be a little bit biased on this, but I'm just not getting excited by the stuff I'm seeing coming out of quantitative surveys, even if they've got very fancy statistics. Maybe I'm missing something. Come and tell me. Very briefly, and I'm not talking a lot today about methodology, but actually, in some ways, my book purports to be a lot about theory, but I think it's actually demonstrating an angle of methodology. And so, as you would gather, I really like a narrative methodology. I find to take a person's life course, it's related to the questions I'm interested in, on its own terms is very interesting and is a different angle to thematic analysis. So working with that here, but also in some other previous work that I've done. So now what? So this is really, and again, okay, I'm going to try not to do too many caveats on what I think this book does or doesn't do, but, did it take me, does this offer a different analysis than what I've got to before? I will say that actually I think the most significant impact was the narrative methodology, because in working through, and remember these interviews, I spent 10 years doing one or the other analysis with them. But there are things I saw here differently that I hadn't saw before. I saw the situation of the students who come in through the extended program and who'd landed up joining a class that they didn't know and had to integrate socially and maybe failed a year and had to join another course, a class. And if you've read the case study, you'll see that really came out in a lot of significance to me in writing it here. I think the next thing that it did enable me to do is say to ask questions beyond the technical, to ask about the purposes of higher education. Because in short, and I'll give you then in final thing, and these are just a few slides I took from the inaugural, some pictures also of our students. Where does this case study, so yeah, sorry, you'll have to read it if you want more. But I took the interviews from students when they were in third year in 2002. And then in the book, there are 14 students have now finished. There are actually 30 in the whole class, but I just worked with 14 in the book. Catch up with them 9 years later and put those two pieces together and tell their stories. So the thing that was key, they're engineering students too. And this we will talk to a little bit in our panel discussion at 5, a little ad for that. How does knowledge and purpose going to be nice? You and I have already debated those topics, knowledge and care. I think it's watch for false dichotomies. Okay, you don't have to come to me later because that's all I'm going to say. And I think, and I've been working with Delia Marshall and other, Sue's also working on this project, this special issue we're doing for higher education. I think that the way that graduates are formed coming out of their grappling with knowledge is very significant. For the engineering students, quite interesting. It's not the actual things they can go and do. Most of them go into a workplace where they don't specifically do I ask them, what do you use out of your 4-year degree? They say, oh, the course you taught us. Well, I teach them something in second year, which is really just chemistry, to be honest. I'm not a very sophisticated engineer. It's just basic chemical calculations in a process. They all do that. The more sophisticated stuff, they do all different things that they learn on the job. But what do they tell me? They tell me I'm a certain kind of person. I'm independent, responsible, I can solve problems, and they give me examples of that. And I'm that way because I engaged with that knowledge that was nearly killed me in 3rd year. But now I move to say, so the one thing is, yeah, the program is great. You know, it turns out these very efficient people who can kind of solve problems. But we lose people along the way. So the classic thing, engineering degrees have a high failure rate. A lot of people don't make it. And so what I started asking was, and a lot of the people's identity is based on the fact that I made it. It was so hard. Other people didn't make it. I made it. And the employers also, it's great. We know that we just got those who survived. My question is, well, what if the logic was different? And you can see we're talking about, like, the cultural conditioning of the space is a one of sink or swim. What if we move to a space where we say, actually, we've selected people who are going to succeed? How would the program sort itself out? So that was, can we move towards an assumption that most students who are selected for the program expect to succeed? And by the way, I'd like to pose that question to the whole of South African higher education. What would it mean if we said, you know, if we take in, 20% of school leavers into higher education, it's fair to say they should be succeeding in higher education. What's happening? So then I'm sort of dreaming these alternatives, which I think critical realism also knows. How could the world be different? Could this be a program that's demanding, but it's demanding in a different way? And the other set of questions I started asking was, and again, you have to read the whole study, but this was a program that shut people's interests down. You just had to focus on the studies. You couldn't do anything else. And I worried a bit about, do we produce the kind of graduates that are really appropriate for the now, who actually need to be a bit broader? So could we make it a slightly enlarged space in terms of what demands from students? And there's this, just restating another question. Could it achieve better outcomes and still retain its strong reputation? And really my sort of final thing is to ask, what is higher education? So I didn't think, and I mean, you can trace earlier analyses of work. I wasn't asking those questions quite in that way until I came to pull things together in this realist perspective. And to me, it's moving from the individual student all the way through to the purpose of higher education for society. And Archer says you can join all the pieces up. Well, you have to try to. And that's my formal talk. So now you can ask more questions. Yeah. And why don't we take a few questions? And I've got a question here as well. I've got it. I'm going to answer too. I've got the first question already here, but let's hear some more. Yep. Do you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Tema Moyo. I'm with the differentiation project. I'm doing my first year. I haven't done a proposal yet. I've probably been using Archer. The question which I wanted to ask was the statement that most of the graduates which you studied were not actually in engineering jobs.
And actually most were in engineering jobs. Yeah. Do you want to ask a little bit more about that?
Yes.
Okay, I'll talk about what jobs in, for sure. I've done more analysis of that. Maybe just take a few questions. Okay. Now let's look at these other ones. Did I do justice to emergence? There's a question. Yeah, here's a question, yes.
Just the right up today, so that you're talking about
LCT. No.
So could you give us a connect on that?
A connect on LCT.
That's what you're talking about. That's what you're talking
Do that.
One question here.
I sometimes get confused with the claim that Asha makes, but I think as you went along this afternoon, I sort of connected, but I would like to explain it better. The ontology, epistemology, and methodology claim that she makes, that a realist, a social realist, should you know, they start at the ontological level, then move to epistemology. Then that determines the kind of methodology that they should use for analysis. So maybe you can talk about that. And the other thing that I wanted to ask from you is what Kasturi mentioned earlier about micro and macro. It looks like Archer said, we were beginning to understand that with Kasturi. Archer said the issue of micro and macro is absolute nonsense in social science. That is individualism and collectivism. We shouldn't look at life that way, studying a pen or studying a group like that. But you should study a system, which can happen in a small group. A system and then the interaction. The macro being the system and then the interaction being the macro.
Okay, yeah, sure.
I have two questions. Number one was on your presentation of Archer's morphogenetic framework, and at the T2 to T3, you linked social interaction with cultural interaction with that arrow. And I'm wondering why you are not linking social conditioning to cultural conditioning, as well as linking.
I'm happy to. I'm very happy to do that.
That's one.
It's a nice question.
And the second one, have you found any limitation to Archer's morphogenetic framework?
I love these questions. Let's should I speak to these, or is there any more that are? Then we can maybe take another tranche. So are we happy that did I talk to emergence enough? That's the sum total of my current understanding of emergence. Maybe next time I have something better to say on that. I think it's important, and I would read Sayer on emergence, to be honest. I talked about shifting to social realism, I think, and creating a book. I think I've talked a bit. So the first question was written for me here is about the acquisition and participation metaphors, which is from Anna Svard's work in maths, which I referenced briefly at the start of the book. Yeah, I mean, there's a tension. It's different. So with Svard's paper, which is an interesting one, it's 98. To me, that comes out of partly personal, a little bit like I said earlier on, the personal constructivist, the social constructivist view of learning. Is learning just acquisition or just participation? Svard says it's both. I mean, I think that's valuable. And I guess, does she say in her paper, it's a bit like the physicists have, is light a particle or wave? Well, it's both. It's just two different angles on it. We worked with Svard's stuff in a paper that we did around discursive identity. I'm happy to give you that as well. What are my views on pedagogy in higher education? That's another question I got given here. I think that's a whole talk. I mean, I think pedagogy is very important. I guess what I was talking earlier, the relation between teaching and learning. And I think it's underplayed currently. I mean, Carl mentioned that in his talk now. He's right. And it's a bit of this, I mean, some writers are saying it's this neoliberal, putting everything on the individual subject of the learner who must make their own way through higher education. Is a bit of this weird outplaying of the space we're currently in. And it's also a bit of an overplay. You heard Carl's very interesting analysis of student-centered, teacher-centered dichotomy, by which I find a very exciting part of his book. I think almost underplayed. I'm pleased he had that in his talk now. These dichotomies are a problem, and that's what that one's also played to. Like, oh, I'm not a teacher anymore, I'm a facilitator. And I don't think anyone who's taking knowledge seriously can really take that seriously, because of course there's someone who's an expert. You've got to hold that space. Of course you've got to explore that in an extraordinary way. I think teaching is complex. I don't think I can talk in any more depth on that now, and really but I'm very happy also there's stuff that I'm currently writing in that way I'm happy to share with you. Engineering jobs, very simply, I mean, it's quite interesting, this crowd, because I've now analyzed, it was a class of, there were 35 that I'd initially interviewed. It was quite a small class at the time, which made the project quite interesting. And all except 2 were working in engineering, 33 out of 35, if I've got it right. No, 32 out of 35. Just about everybody was working in engineering. just about everybody was working in South Africa. Both were things that you wouldn't necessarily have expected. The long and the short is I think there's a huge premium on skills in this country. And I think the differential in salary you get if you go and actually work in engineering is very high compared to doing something else. But that was an interesting study. And we're doing more work now on looking at all our graduates over a decade and what they're doing. The Connect on LCT, thanks for spotting the thing on the program. I thought no one would spot that because, of course, the title I had here was not at all related to that. My choice there was larger because I knew that Carl was going to do a day and a half with you. Who is the person asking the LCT Connect? Yes, thanks. Again, I think it's the theory appropriate to the question that you're asking. So I'm working with 3 PhD students at the moment who are doing curriculum studies, some using LCT, some using more fundamental Bernstein, and looking at the logic of curriculum in engineering. And I think it's very important work. It's not the work I was talking to currently here. So I guess and for myself, my link to that was that I felt it was very important to do a detour through thinking about knowledge and thinking about the curriculum. But it's not my central question for my work here. So I've got to certainly contextualize the engineering curriculum, why it is the way it is. I need to also problematize it a little bit. And I'm doing some stuff now looking at engineering curricula in different parts of the world, and I'm having to beef up a bit on some of that. And I do think there's value in a lot of LCT as well. I did a review of Carl's book where I tried to speak to what I thought the value was there. If you're doing structure and agency, so to me the most significant structure that students encounter is the curriculum. That is what constrains and enables. And so in that regard, I do speak to curriculum. Of course, it's also imbued with culture because it's a discursive thing as well. I struggled a bit with if it's curriculum is structure or culture. I think it's a structure, but it's underpinned by knowledge. Does that connect? No.
It does ties in what Carl is speaking about knowledge. So your curriculum essentially becomes a translation of knowledge, including knowledge through your curriculum. I'm just thinking about it.
Yeah. No, look, learning is taking on of knowledge. So you've got to think about what field of knowledge you're talking about. So you've got to understand it. Yes.
So the question I would have, so how is that curriculum constituted? And what is the power base of that curriculum?
Well, indeed.
So then your LCT really comes in strongly. Yeah.
And I haven't maybe gone on the LCT in my own work here as far as I could have. I worked really mainly more just with fundamental Bernstein ideas. I think the key thing, you're absolutely right, on curriculum, you're asking the questions of what power interests are served by the curriculum. I think some of our curriculum work stops short of that, and then in essence it doesn't get to an explanatory space. So that's the explanatory move for curriculum studies. So, yeah. We could chat more as well. I think are we having drinks after the panel discussion tonight? So I'm very happy to take any of these conversations further with people. Linking ontology, epistemology, methodology. And I didn't talk a lot of that here, and also, in fact, methodology. So, yeah, I've got other things I can share with you also. I've put some of my thoughts down. And absolutely, and this is you can mix and match theories, but they have to be ontologically consistent. They've got to be epistemologically consistent. Ontology, how is the world? Epistemology, how do we come to know? And methodology, how do we put together this research study? They have to hang together. It's just like all these threads of your thesis that needs to build together, and then the particular theory you use. That feels like another whole seminar, so I think I'll just leave it on that. Micro-macro is really interesting, and Archer's take on that. And as I read it, and there would be people here who know more sociology than I do, but that's like a massive debate in sociology is what level do you do your explanation? And Archer, I think, I won't say evades that, but like I was saying earlier on, you can move up and down the levels. So and what I love about his sociology is the complex human with their intentionality, that it's the heart of it. And she's argued, there's a recent paper that's really nice. It says you can't, I'm sure you've read some of this system stuff that says, you can use the same theories you do to study traffic jams, to study students in higher education. You just look at the big patterns kind of thing. And she's like pushed right back against that to say that's not a theory. if it doesn't have an explanation which has at the heart human choices, actions, constraints, then it's not a social theory. And I have to say I find that quite powerful. And I think it's very important, especially nowadays with the advent of big data. You can do the most extraordinary things with like the kind of data that comes off the back end of a classroom management system. And you can claim to see patterns of all sorts, but you have to go back to Sayre. Just because it's a correlation or a pattern, it's not an explanation. Where's the human at the center of it? So I think Archer, well, she would say she gets us past the macro-micro debate, as you said. And I think I can see that in how, as I say, previously I think I would have said, so 10 years ago, I've been asked to talk about research. I say I'm very interested in students and how they make sense of these constraints. They're in a difficult program, and some people are doing successful things, some people not doing successful things, and I want to know about that. This has been a progressive, really about 10 years of opening up to these bigger questions. What is the purpose of higher education? Whose interests does it serve? What is the role of higher education in contemporary South Africa? And I think we can't evade those questions. Otherwise, we're just sort of fiddling around. I loved your question about the links in that morphogenetic cycle. Can we go to the slide that's got the 2 cycles? Because that's very good. And it helps actually explain the diagram. So let's just, I think it's that one. Yeah, can we, sorry if this is not clear. I can see it's not as clear as it might have been. I won't blame the room, or it's me, most probably. Can we go into slideshow? Play from current slide, excellent, yeah. So your question says, so cultural conditioning constrains and enables interaction that is defined by the cultural conditioning, and that is related in an emergent way to the outcomes there. So your question is, doesn't cultural conditioning influence social interaction? Yeah, I know. And how does structural, does that not influence that? And the answer is no, because this is the interaction that is conditioned by structure. Yeah, yeah.
I'm interested in why alone you build social cultural interaction to social interaction without linking cultural conditioning to structural conditioning.
Oh, there, a link there.
Then you talked about the fact that it's difficult to separate them.
Yes. No, so you even better. That's another question which I like. So Archer, if I'm channeling Archer right, okay, this is where structure and culture interact, between T2 and T3 in human interaction. So when you do your analysis, obviously the world is always intertangled, by the way, but structural conditioning cannot influence cultural conditioning in that way. It's only through, and by the way, the move from here to there is through emergent properties. And it's only in the space here, an interaction is of individual humans and collectively having desires, projects, ambitions, trying things, not trying other things. That's where the worlds of structure and culture connect. Where this circle is important in that the outcome of a previous structure cycle can play into, and this is a good question you're making me think about, can play into the cultural conditions, because the relations of who has roles and positions might change, which might then have an impact on the cultural condition in another cycle. By the way, these happen on different time scales as well, another problem with the diagram.
Sorry. If they can be merged quite nicely here, and then you're linking it back to the cycle that, of course, continues, how is it possible to neatly separate them there?
Never. So the neat separation's never easy. You have to look, so you have to be looking in your data. You have to know, and it's not always easy. Am I talking here about structure or am I talking about culture? I don't think it's easy.
And the agent is even out of this picture now.
Sorry, what?
I say the agency is out of this picture now because that's also there.
No, indeed. So you're absolutely right. There's now a third cycle, which is not here, which is the cycle when you're talking about the morphogenesis of agency. That is the group working. That is the formation of corporate agents, the formation of social actors. And indeed, so those changes are also on a morphogenetic cycle. And of course, changes in agency also impact on next cycle. I mean, if someone wants to tell you that like education research is the easy route out, you know what? You should rather go and do like nuclear physics. I'm not joking. You guys think this? I mean, your questions. This is what I'm grappling with as well. So, and by the way, that's my understanding at present of Archer. And I go back, and every time I read her stuff again and again, I get another
understanding of it. Yeah.
And then, but actually also to say, so don't spend 2 years reading Culture and Agency, because it must just go crazy.
And that leads to my next
and
question.
get into your data and try and use the concepts, and then get other people to say, is it working? I mean, we had this big debate we found we've definitely got a contradiction in the world of AD in higher education, but was it necessary, was it contingent? We're working it through, we're looking at the data, we're saying, okay, here we can see a logical relationship. So it's in the trying it out. And by the way, like, we haven't got a lot to go on. I mean, go and look at you know, how many people are using Archer in higher education. There's a couple of South African researchers, really. Then there's Archer's group. There's a PhD student there that's quite interesting. So there's not like clear answers. I think I really am attracted to the idea this is productive. But you know, what I wanted to say on the thing, like, you know, that metaphor, don't act because you've got a hammer, I think you nail everything, or...
That's
I mean, to make you feel better, this one article I'm working on trying to trace, looking at engineering degrees globally and historically. How did they come to be? Why did we have a 4-year bachelor degree, long and short, and its patterns of accreditation? And I wrote this up using Archer. I'm Archer in it, you know, structure, culture, da 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 da. I've got a couple of good colleagues who I've sent this draft paper to. And long and short is, I've been told quite clearly by people who are real Archer fans, like, you don't need this theory here. It's not doing any work for you. I want to say that. So, you know, and how do you know this? You try something.
It doesn't work.
You put it out for consumption. You saw, like, you've got a supervisor. That's great. And then use a bigger network as well of people who can comment on your work. That's how research works. I'm just so, like, deeply in that space at the moment. Yesterday, I had 4 emails that came in my box, which were people who had commented, stuff that I'd sent out. I've been working quite a bit on trying to write up various bits and pieces, and people that I really, really valued who had commented on stuff. I have to tell you this, in the afternoon, 3 things had come. I was like, gee, this is a bumper day. There's Sue Clegg commented on something, Joe Miller commented on something, Kevin Williams commented on something. If you know any of those names, you know those are like unbelievable people who read my paper, who were seriously critical, but still basically said you should work on this thing, you know, so don't drop it, and I trust they wouldn't have said that. And as a writer, as I was telling my friend, I was saying it was a fantastic day, I love getting critical comment, and my commitment to that was slightly tested, because last night the 4th email came, it's from a journal, because there's a paper I'd submitted to a journal, with fantastic comments, but a straight rejection. So here's 2 reviewers' comments, like, amazing, like 2, it was a bit of a cheeky paper about scholarship of teaching and learning, and clearly it went to people who know this field, and they found all the holes. Holes I didn't know existed. And I've been sitting thinking about this is at the heart, and I thought I want to tell you that I get journal papers rejected. I mean, of course I do, but maybe you think I don't. Like, once you write a book, you walk on water. No, you don't. People like Sue Clegg are honest about that as well. But that's how you develop, because I tried something and it's not quite working. I have to go back and work with that. And you learn that in your PhD by having a supervisor who gives you those comments.
That's why I asked the next question.
Any limitations? Yeah. I think I think a lot of these theories are quite attractive, are hard to operationalize. I mean, I've got the scars from discourse analysis, but that's because I'm not a linguist. So when I read Who's Read Jane's G and thought they can do a G analysis, because it's like, it seems so like there. And then, ooh, okay, I can do a baby G analysis, but I can't do it much further. Yeah, I mean, any theory, you've got to get deeply into it. You've got to know what you're talking about.
I mean, with your experience with reading her and writing about her, what are the limitations you found? And how are you?
So I find it quite hard to, I suddenly remember this thing's been taped, but at any rate, I'll be honest, I find parts of her stuff. So Kevin Williams says her books get more readable towards the end. At some point, her husband started reading them and editing them for her. I find that a lot of what to me is happening in her books are arguments between a bunch of sociologists, which is not so important to me, and there seems a lot of stuff rehashed. So I jump over things. Her empirical work also doesn't necessarily speak directly to mine, which is the emergence of school systems in France in the 1700s. Interesting, but I lack the knowledge sometimes to really understand that. I think you've got to get working with the stuff. I actually think that's the thing, and see if it works. And there's a critical community here. You're going to get shredded if it's not working, then you're going to pick yourself up and work it more. I think, though, to do education research in South Africa, we've got to be working with some degree of a critical sociological framing. I mean, look, okay, it's great. People must do, and particularly to early childhood, I think there's important stuff on psychological development and so on. But if you're talking like higher education, I think we've got to get to the bigger questions. So then you've got to, and then your options, what are your options? Archer, Bourdieu. What are the other options? I'm blank now. Long day. Foucault and those guys, yeah. Okay, like a discourse angle, discourse analysis, literacies. Having a sudden very blank moment of Basco. Well, no, Basco's not. Basco's too much of a meta theory. Yeah, but then sorry. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm never going to work with Derrida or Foucault. I don't have the background to do that. But you know what I would also say? Let's get reading in education. So there's fundamental, let's not be stuck to higher education studies. Read this stuff, but also, I mean, use the time to read Dewey, for example. Every American who's an education researcher knows they're Dewey back and forth. And unless you did a better, like, B.Ed or whatever than I did, I feel I've got a few gaps there. So go and read what people I go to my latest feeling is that we should go to the fundamental education research conferences, not stick to higher education or AED or whatever. Big advert. The Sierra conference was fantastic this year. Definitely the South African Education Research Association. So, yeah, read deeply, hey guys. Maybe that's the end point, hey? I find it quite hard to, I suddenly remember this thing's been taped, but at any rate. I'll be honest, I find parts of her stuff, so Kevin Williams says her books get more readable towards the end. At some point, her husband started reading them and editing them for her. I find that a lot of what to me is happening in her books are arguments between a bunch of sociologists, which are not so important to me, and there seems a lot of stuff rehashed. So I jump over things. Her empirical work also doesn't necessarily speak directly to mine, which is the emergence of school systems in France in the 1700s. Interesting, but I lack the knowledge sometimes to really understand that. I think you've got to get working with the stuff. I actually think that's the thing, and see if it works. And there's a critical community here. You're going to get shredded if it's not working, then you're going to pick yourself up and work it more. I think though, to do education research in South Africa, we've got to be working with some degree of a critical sociological framing. I mean, look, okay, it's great. People must do, and particularly to early childhood, I think there's important stuff on psychological development and so on. But if you're talking like higher education, I think we've got to get to the bigger questions. So then you've got to, and then your options, what are your options? Archer, Bourdieu, what are the other options? I'm blank now.
Pascal.
Foucault and those guys, yeah. Okay, like a discourse angle, discourse analysis, literacies. I'm a very blank moment.
Pascal.
Well, no, Pascal's not. Pascal's too much of a meta theory. Yeah. But then that. Sorry. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm never going to work with Derrida or Foucault. I don't have the background to do that. But you know what I would also say? Let's get reading in education. So there's fundamental, let's not be stuck to higher education studies. Read this stuff, but also, use the time to read Dewey, for example. Every American who's an education researcher knows their Dewey back and forth. And unless you did a better like B.Ed or whatever than I did, I feel I've got a few gaps there. So go and read what people in. I go to my latest feeling is that we should go to the fundamental education research conferences, not stick to higher education or AD or whatever. Big advert. The Sierra conference was fantastic this year. Definitely the South African Education Research Association. So. Yeah, read deeply here, guys. That's the main point,
Kayla wanted to say something.
Just very briefly to say thank you to Jenny. I personally particularly loved your honesty, your humility,
intellectual humility,
intellectual questions you continue to pose to yourself. And it just shows a level of scholarship that this book, this neat book we all see, didn't happen overnight. It's over many years, far longer than we were understanding as a group. And it's posed probably more questions, and it will continue to pose as your research goes. So there's no real end. It's, somebody said, was it Carl? I'm using copper, that you pose a question, you do all the stuff, and it emerges with another question, and that's. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that with us, and we look forward to hearing you this evening. People, we meet 5 o'clock in the council chamber. Any other messages, Sue? Okay. Rob? Okay. Great. See you later.